Have you ever known or met someone who is completely self-deluded? Probably. During one of the recent snowstorms up north, there was a rash of flight cancellations. And at one particular airline counter, there was a long line of passengers who were waiting somewhat patiently to be rescheduled on other flights because their flight had been canceled. So they're all in a line, and this line stretched really far back. Suddenly, a man from the back of the line stormed all the way to the front of the line, walked up to the airline counter, slammed his fist down on the counter, and barked, "Who is in charge here?" A very timid-looking young flight attendant responded, "I am, sir." And he said, "Well, I need to get on this flight immediately, and I better be seated in first class." The flight attendant responded, "I'm sorry, sir, but this flight has been canceled. There is no flight for you to get on. Now, if you'll just return to your spot in line, I'm happy to, we're trying to make other arrangements, but please return to your spot in the line, and we'll make sure you get taken care of." The man got red in the face, started puffing himself up, and shouted, "Do you have any idea who I am?" The flight attendant just leaned forward into her microphone and said, "Apparently this man has forgotten who he is. If anyone knows the identity of this man, please approach the counter to claim him." Well, needless to say, that got his attention, made him very embarrassed. The crowd erupted into laughter. He went to the back of the line and waited his turn. But you know, all of us have encountered people like this. People who are self-deluded about their importance. We've met people who are puffed up, arrogant, selfish, and just plain full of themselves. We know what self-deluded people are like. But the harder truth is this: we are all self-deluded people. We may not go all around making ridiculous demands at airline counters, but all of us live under the sway of three very powerful delusions. We are deluded about our self-sufficiency, we're deluded about our self-determination, and we are deluded about our self-importance. In our gospel reading this morning, these delusions are identified as temptations. Because at its core, temptation is an invitation to a delusional life, a life that is completely divorced from reality. That's what Satan was trying to do with Jesus. Satan is tempting Jesus to be deluded about his self-sufficiency, his self-determination, and his self-importance. But instead, Jesus shows us how to see past these three delusions to the reality of our true identity and calling. Jesus shows us how to give up our lives to God so that we can have abundant lives that are full of God's gifts. So today I want to look at how we can follow Jesus through the desert, right? We're on this 40-day journey with Jesus through the desert, and I want to look at how we can avoid the mirages that Satan is going to throw in front of our eyes as we travel together. The secret to avoiding these delusions, not being trapped by these mirages, is to give up our lives so that we can receive them back as a gift from God. So first, the delusion of self-sufficiency. Look with me at Luke chapter 4, verse 2. Jesus was hungry. That might be the biggest understatement in the entire gospel. 40 days without food, and it starts by saying Jesus was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." Satan, the devil, is inviting Jesus to delude himself that he can be self-sufficient, that he can provide for himself, that he doesn't need God the Father to provide for him. In fact, in all of the accounts of the temptations in the desert, it always starts with this temptation. You ever thought about that? Why? Why does it start with the temptation for food? Well, it could be because that's the most presenting issue that Jesus has, right? He's very hungry. But I think there's something deeper going on here. I think it's because that this is always the first human temptation. This was the first temptation for Eve, right? Eve was tempted with food. Take the fruit for yourself. Feed yourself. God hasn't provided enough for you. The whole garden with all of its fruit trees, that's not enough for you. You need to take care of yourself and meet your own needs. So take the fruit and supply for yourself. You don't need God to provide for you. Provide for yourself. When we are deluded into thinking that we are self-sufficient, then we are unable to receive things as gifts, right? When we get things for ourselves, we only have ourselves to thank, and we no longer have to thank God. 1 Timothy 6:7 says, "For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world." Right? I've had the privilege of seeing all three of my children born. Every child that I've seen born, at least, when they come into this world, they are screaming, naked, afraid, and usually very hungry. All of us started out like that. We forget that, right? Because we don't remember being born. If you do, let me know after the service. I'd be curious to hear your tale. But none of us remember being born. And so we forget where we came from, where we started in this life. We forget that we brought nothing into this life, and so that everything that we have in this life, we have received from others and ultimately from the Lord, right? No one gave themselves anything. We received everything as a gift. Scripture says that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of the heavenly lights. In other words, anything good that we have in this life, we received as a gift from God. When my wife and I were first married, we'd been married about a year, we found these really cheap tickets to Puerto Rico. Spirit Airlines had recently started flying there, and so we found $100 round-trip tickets to Puerto Rico. And so we said, let's do it, let's go. And so Airbnb had just come out, and so we found some really cheap lodging on Airbnb. And one of the things we discovered is sometimes when you find really cheap accommodations through Airbnb, there's a reason why it's so cheap. So we show up at this place, and it just smells terrible. It's just awful. And we were exhausted because we had this like midnight to 3 a.m. flight. We got in at 3:30 in the morning. And we go in, and I couldn't even fall asleep for an hour because the smell was so bad, as tired as I was. And so we realized, we do not want to have to stay here another night. But we didn't have a lot of money to spend. And so we were telling our tale of woe. There was street music in the town we were staying in. And we were out dancing in the street, listening to music. And we met this older couple, and we're kind of telling them our tale of woe. And this older couple says to us, "Oh, we have this small little guest house. It isn't very nice, but, you're welcome to stay there. You could just pay us whatever you're paying at the other place. Just pay us that amount, and we'll let you stay there. No problem." And so at this point, we figure it cannot be any worse than where we are currently staying. And so we say, sure, why not? So they give us directions to their house, and we pull up. We go up there that evening. And we pull up to an absolute mansion perched on top of these cliffs. Outside the mansion, there's an infinity pool. Do you know what this is? I'd never seen one before. But there's an infinity pool that they had lined up with the horizon of the ocean. So when you sat in the pool, it felt like you were in the Caribbean. And then there was all this nice patio furniture. And then next to the mansion, there was a mini mansion. And it had a pool table inside. It had hammocks strung up on this really nice porch. It was just absolutely luxurious. We were delivered out of our bad accommodations and brought into the lap of luxury. And I think in that moment, there was no question for me or Megan that God had absolutely given us this gift, and we had done nothing to earn it, right? We saw it as a gift. Well, the Israelites had a similar story. In Deuteronomy 26, God commands his people to recite the story of God's incredible provision. Listen again to the story that God commanded them to tell. This is what they're supposed to say every time they come to the temple. And you shall make response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. Every time they would harvest food from the land, God commanded them to retell the story of how they had been living in slavery, how they had nothing. They were wandering, they were homeless. They didn't have any land. And so any produce that they got from the land was a gift from God. And they would recite that. They would tell that story. They were required to acknowledge that man does not live by bread alone, that they needed God to deliver them, to save them. They had to give credit where credit was due. They went from being slaves with no rights, living in a foreign land, to being landed gentry, right? Wealthy, prosperous. And you would think that given their experience, they would have no trouble with this. But the point of this passage is that they had to be commanded to recite this story because they started to think, when they were harvesting their food, that it was their food to begin with, that it was their land. They forgot that it was a gift from God. So God had to keep reminding them and say, tell the story again. Keep telling the story so you never forget that everything you have has been given to you. Like the Israelites, we can be deluded into thinking that we are self-sufficient. We forget what it's been like in the smelly room, right? And we think we've always lived in the mansion. But what God wants us to do is to remember that everything we've received has been given to us by God. There's nothing in this whole creation that doesn't belong to God. One of my favorite corny jokes is about a scientist arguing with God. And the scientist says, you know, God, we don't really need you anymore because we figured out how to create life. We've made all these great discoveries. You know, I can do anything that you can do. I can do it just the same. And God said, okay, you say you can create life? Go ahead and make a human being. And the scientist says, sure, no problem. And he starts gathering materials together, and God says, get your own dirt, right? Get your own dirt. Everything belongs to the Lord. And so when we receive everything we have as a gift from God, it's so much easier to give it up to God because it was never really ours to begin with. Everything belongs to him. And so we take it as a gift and we can let go of it as a gift. So that's the first delusion. The second delusion is the delusion of self-determination. Luke 4:5. And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time and said to him, to you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours. The devil is offering Jesus authority. Authority. Now, you might think that's not much of a temptation for Jesus, but let's remember when Jesus gets all authority. Jesus does not receive all authority in heaven and on earth until when? Till Matthew 28, right? The end of the gospel, towards the end of the gospel, after he has been tortured and crucified and risen, that's when he receives all authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me by my Father in the Great Commission. In other words, God had set a pathway for him to receive all authority. And that pathway went straight through the cross. What Satan is tempting Jesus with here is a shortcut, a way around the cross, a way to get authority without having to go through the pain and suffering and death of the cross. But when we take a shortcut around God's plan, we miss out on God's blessing. We can be deluded into thinking that there are shortcuts in this life. We can think that there's a shortcut to getting what we want out of life. But there are no shortcuts to becoming a disciple of Jesus. We have to be determined to follow the way of God and give up trying to be self-determined, to determine ourselves about the best way to make our way through life. We have to make up our minds that we're going to follow Jesus to the cross. Luke 9:23, Jesus says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Right? The pathway for us to be exalted by the Lord is for us to give up things. It's when we lay down our lives that we find it. When God led the Israelites through the desert for 40 years, it didn't seem like what God had determined was actually the best plan, right? Go wander in the desert for 40 years until most of you die. That doesn't sound like a great plan. But the reality is that the Israelites would have never entered the promised land without the 40-year journey through the desert. We cannot receive God's authority unless we walk in God's way. I see this with people all the time. They want these blessings from God. They want God to do good things in their life, but they want them now. They want to take a shortcut to the good stuff that God gives. But often the way that God works in our lives is through the daily discipline of laying down our life, taking up our cross to follow him. Our destination is the exact same as Jesus' destination, and we cannot take a shortcut around the cross. The third and final delusion is the delusion of self-importance. Luke chapter 4, verse 9. "And the devil took Jesus to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone.'" Jesus is being tempted here to show everybody how important he is, to show off, right? But the reality is that God the Father has already declared Jesus' importance. Jesus did not succumb to this temptation because he had learned how to live his life for an audience of one. He didn't need to impress people. In fact, oftentimes when there was a crowd gathered around him, he would run away up to a mountaintop to pray to that audience of one. He wasn't concerned about what other people thought of him. I think all of us have this kind of innate desire to be loved, to be liked, to be important. Whether that's to a specific person that we want to like us, or whether it's just in general. We want to know that we matter. We want to know that people notice us. That's how social media works, right? It wouldn't work very well if people didn't want people to think they were important, right? It wouldn't work as a business model for sure. We have an insatiable hunger for importance in our hearts. What I want to say to you this morning is that we cannot do anything to make ourselves more important or less important in God's eyes. God has already determined that we are important enough to die for. He has said that your life is worth the life of his own son. That's how important you are. That's how valuable you are. And there's nothing we can add to or take away from that importance. That's what God says about us. And so Jesus was free to give away his entire life because he didn't live under the sway of these different delusions. Jesus wasn't deluded about his self-sufficiency. He depended on God for everything in his life. He wasn't deluded about his self-determination. He submitted to God's will for him to go to the cross. He said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And Jesus wasn't deluded about his self-importance. He knew he was important to God the Father. He knew God's love. He knew that God delighted in him. When we know that, when we know that we belong to God, when we know that the path of the cross is the way of life, and when we know that God is going to provide for everything we need, we can live a very different type of life. Jesus' first steps towards the cross started in the desert, where he was tempted by Satan for 40 days. But Jesus learned to reorient his life, to make it outward focused, to be able to make it through those 40 days and not fall into temptation. That's what we're striving to do this Lent. For 40 days, we're trying to reorient our priorities, refocus our lives on giving up everything to God. And so as we journey through the desert, don't be deceived by the delusions and mirages. We are heading to a specific destination. We are heading to the cross of Christ. Do not turn aside. Don't fall for the mirages in this life. And never, never turn back. Amen.